Good evening, everyone. My name is Madeline Day Delpha, and I'm Assistant Director, Programs and Community Engagement at the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University. Thank you so much for coming to our first installment of the Forest of Changing Shapes film series organized by the Rose Art Museum. This series is offered in conjunction with the exhibition Hugh Hayden Homework, which is curated by Dr. Ganeet Ankori, the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator at the Rose Art Museum, and Dr. Sarah Montross, Director of the DeCordova Sculpture Park and Museum, the trustees. Hugh Hayden's uncanny sculptures and installations evoke aspects of African American identity and ways in which history and stereotypes pervade the American cultural landscape. In Hayden's work, the familiar becomes threatening as natural elements overtake human environments, thorny branches sprout from houses and school desks, designer clothes are clad in cherry bark, and wooden skeletons become fused with the tools of manual labor. This exhibition must be experienced in person, and it is on view at the Rose through June 1st. But we could think of no better person to invite to explore Hayden's surreal imagery than Brandeis' own Dr. Brandon Callendar. Brandon Callendar is an assistant professor of English here at Brandeis University and specializes in Black, queer, and Black horror studies. His manuscript, Getting Behind in Black Gay Men's Literature, is now under contract with Ohio Press, and he's been featured as a specialist on NPR's A1 to discuss how horror creates meaning. We invited Brandon to put together a series of films that explore the themes and imageries of Hugh Hayden's work, and we were both honored and completely delighted that he agreed. And so we're in for such a treat tonight. We're going to hear from Brandon about why we chose the films we did. And so please join me in giving a warm welcome to the very brilliant Dr. Brandon Callendar.
Everyone, thank you for coming out. Just 1 second while we get everything started. So I just wanted to actually begin with the end of this film. This is Little Shop of Horrors. And one of the things I love deeply about the ending, this question mark, exclamation question mark, is this was actually the ending that was censored from the film, so it didn't see the light for quite a few years. The ending they went with is not this wonderful tragedy where the city is destroyed by this black laughing plant. The director specifically said and specified the plant should sound real black, real street, and malevolent. That was a very intentional choice. The ending they went with instead has the white couple happily escaping to the suburbs and escaping the city, which is very much associated with racial distress. And so I wanted to begin with this because I really think it captures the mood of this series. And in that way, I'm really grateful to Maddie, to Ganeet, to everybody here tonight for coming out to be able to be with me in this Forest of Changing Shapes series. And so I thought maybe I would just begin by talking a little bit about what was the sort of inception of this project. I was invited to look at a series of Hugh Hayden's stunning artworks and to think of what imagery from horror they triggered in my mind. And I love that because on one hand, it's this ability to explore this associative chain of the horror films that register when looking at his art. But I wanted to use it as an opportunity to also think about the associations that come to mind for us when we look at Hugh Hayden's artworks. And so the project really came together through the intersection of two kinds of imagery. The first, and again you can see these down at the Rose, is this beautiful ironwork that Hugh Hayden does, where he has African masks that are sort of distending and extending from these skillets. And in a series which has often been discussed to be about the American dream and the unavailability of the American dream to so many folks, to black folks, when thinking of who comes to mind in horror, the figure who shot up for me was Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street. Krueger, who is a figure who terrorizes kids in their nightmares. When I teach him my Blackness in Horror class, I often think about how one of the horrors of Elm Street is the fact that the town participated in this act of vigilante violence and formed a lynch mob, and that's the language that's used, to kill Krueger, which is repressed. And so the horror that comes to light in the film series is the kids discovering my parents did what, which is part of that horror. I love in that way that the first moments where Freddy Krueger enters into the film, his face sort of distends hard surfaces. So you see him bending bedroom walls. Across the series, you see these other scenes of him blending, making plastic malleable so he can manifest his face. And I thought of this as a really lovely way of thinking of the kind of iron work that Hugh Hayden does and bringing those African masks to bear on the home in the homework exhibit. The second association that I want to explore, and this is the one I'll be pursuing with you a lot tonight, is what it does to think of his work in the subgenre of plant horror. And so in this really lovely piece, which I'll be coming back to, Briar Patch. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Can you hear me? All right, perfect. In Briar Patch, one of the tropes that brings this series together for me in my mind and tonight is I was thinking of the idea of distressing wood. So distressing wood is when you sort of make a wood look worn or make it look like you could see the history in it through a process of sort of scratching it, burning it, sort of messing with the surface in order to give it this sort of rustic look. And part of me is thinking about, and this is what I want to think about tonight, black art is almost a sort of art of distressing wood, thinking of how it brings to bear this history in the way that we look at wood in order to be able to explore those sort of repressed histories. In a similar way, I want to think about what it means, though, that experience of looking for those associations can be very distressing, I think, in terms of how we're made to feel when we look at this artwork. And so just to preview tonight, I'm going to be talking about each of the films when we actually get to them, but tonight is really about setting the stage for thinking about these associations. So, in a 1972 pilot episode, I'll be coming back to these images, for the paranormal investigation show In Search Of, Leonard Nimoy raises the question of plant sentience, asking, if plants can communicate, what are they saying? To whom or what are they talking? The opening pans from a tree to a botanist discussing the question of plant sentience with children beneath, and the tree now seems to almost eerily be observing them, as if the tree is eavesdropping. And though this might feel threatening, the show does reassure the viewers that plants are in fact empathetic beings. They say that plants respond to the pain felt by another living being. And the knowledge that plants have by the show's end seems to issue from the other side of death. And so here's Leonard Nimoy saying at the end of the episode, if you've ever awakened in the night with the knowledge that something has happened to someone you love and found out you were right, you might have wondered who or what was the messenger. One intriguing idea is the possibility that plants carry the message. Apparently plants feel and hear and speak to each other. Can they talk to us? This idea that plants might hold secrets beyond our understanding isn't always comforting. And in fact, it has long been a source of horror within at least one subgenre, plant horror, which reminds us how deeply unsettling the idea of talking plants has been in film and fiction. Think Day of the Triffids, with its carnivorous plants eerily conversing or pattering to one another. Think of all those other killer plant films from the 1950s about exotic plants endangering white explorers. Their movement, their speech, their very indifference to the human life they consume, all of it challenges our sense of supremacy, empire, and dominion. All rehearses a concern voiced within Day of the Triffids about cities that were destined to go the way of others under the jungles. In these stories, nature fights back, and with it comes a fear that our cities, our civilizations, might one day vanish beneath the roots and vines. But many eco-horror scholars today find relief where nature fights back. And my talk tonight examines the overlooked joy that Black folks might feel in watching plants and branches rise up against the spaces we have built. Where the forest is taken to be a primal source of terror in horror studies, it was, for many Black fugitives, a refuge from what called itself civilization. The horror for Black folk is less about what trees were doing to civilization than what civilization had done to the trees. Unlike Vine horror films, man-eating plants, within Black literatures, trees do not frighten because they move. They move because they are rooted in frightening histories. Black horror is less about beholding the agency of the tree in itself than its conscription and its subsequent weighing down in what Catherine McCritchie has called landscapes of racial terror. So Nimoy's invitation to see trees as harboring knowledge from the other side represents, in fact, the common anxiety in so much Black literature. Black writers regularly depict trees as reservoirs of traumatic knowledge, and I found this out not from reading horror, but from the most ordinary scenes in Black gay poetry. Take, for instance, Ricky Laurentis' poem Southern Gothic from Boy with the Thorns, which shows how a boy climbing a tree can easily slip into a collective memory of trauma. Simple pine, oak, grand magnolia, he said, they frighten him. What they hold in their silent silences. Sometimes a boy will slip from his climbing, drown, but the myth knows why. Sometimes a boy will swing with the leaves. The mood of that tree, as Laurentis writes in The Conditions for a Southern Gothic, can only brood within the South. As the volume's title suggests, there is always a certain prick, a plash, a punctum in this beautiful landscape that rolls out before our eyes the kind of lynching scenes detailed elsewhere in his collection. Here, the trees become witnesses to a terrifying history that trips him up while playing, because the very ground on which he plays has been rendered mythic by lynching. And so I think even of Stephen King's 2019 film In the Tall Grass, where the protagonist has this fear, the grass knows all the kid fears. This is in fact like a common sentiment that comes up again and again in so much ordinary depictions of Black life in literature. Yeah, I'm having a hard time up here. Such trees frighten because they have been used in a history that the Black boy knows all too well. His tendency to be suspicious of an otherwise beautiful land is characteristic of Black writing. For instance, Black nature scholars like Kimberly Ruffin, Stephanie K. Dunning, and Camille Dungy observe the scarcity of pastoral language in Black nature writing. Trees, in particular, Dungy points out, are extensions of how the natural world has been used to subjugate African Americans, and often they become these sort of witnesses to grief. Think of the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar's 1900 poem, The Haunted Oak, whose tree bemoans the lynching history that has left it barren. I feel the rope against my bark, Dunbar writes, and the weight of him in my grain. I feel in the throe of his final woe the touch of my own last pain. And never more shall leaves come forth on the bough that bears the bane. While such moments show how trees were made distressing, I'm also interested in how we as storytellers and image makers also play a role in the production of this charged landscape which trips the Black queer boy up. Despite the most important critical race work that Haunting performs in unearthing the Gothic histories of race outdoors, we might also consider the emotional hardships that Black subjects incur as stewards of this haunting land. How do the stories we tell make this slippage into a landscape of terror feel inevitable? How do they shape a world where Black subjects cannot go forest bathing without being expected to turn up a dirty history of racial violence? And so I'm thinking a lot about the way that this work of sort of distressing the wood is such an important project in a lot of Black culture, Black image making. And it's valuable because, again, it brings to the fore those racial histories of violence, but it also is important because it unsettles those spaces of dominion, I think, in bringing that up. Since the first known novel by an African-American woman, Hannah Craft's The Bondswoman's Narrative, 1850s, Black authors have used ghosts to weigh down these trees of history. Well before it becomes a haunt in the supernatural sense, Craft begins her Gothic novel with a tale of the linden tree, which is already part of a landscape of terror through the punishments administered there. Noting the wild and weird influence that was supposed to belong to this tree, Craft writes, many a time had its roots been manured with human blood. Slaves had been tied to its trunk to be whipped or sometimes gibbeted on its branches. While this diet makes the tree grow fearsome to the slave, it only becomes so to the slave owners through the curse voiced by an enslaved woman, Rose, who is suspended there beside her dog to watch it starve. When the punishment is through, Rose refuses to be taken down by the master in order to ensure that if she cannot move on, neither will they. Her brooding words fix the landscape in time. No, it shall not be. I will hang here till I die as a curse to this house, and I will come here after I am dead to prove its bane. In sunshine and shadow by day and by night, I will brood over this tree and weigh down its branches. And when death or sickness or misfortune is to befall the family, ye may listen, and you will most assuredly hear the creaking of its limbs, she says. The Gothic grants Rose a power to unsettle the dominion the master holds over the land, but her curse is double-edged. The creaking tree may unsettle the master, but it also distresses the enslaved, leading craft to write that even during joyous occasions, beyond them and over them, through the mingled sounds of joyous music and rain and wind, I heard the ominous creaking of the linden tree. Its creaking foreshadows that even in the most beautiful spaces, what the narrator calls the curse of destiny attached to my race emerges. And one question the novel raises explicitly is whether enslavement can, in the novel's words, destroy the abiding appreciation of the beautiful that seems inherent in the human soul. The linden, with its ominous creak, hovers over many depictions of beauty in the novel, as if to ask whether the tragic fate of Rose can overshadow even the beauty of flowers. And so these are moments, again, where you have Black authors who are sort of guiding the associations, how we look at the landscape, how we look at wood. One of the stories I'm not going to spend time with, but Charles Chestnut's 1888 story, Poe Sandy, comes to mind, where it's this moment where a formerly enslaved man crafts the story about haunted wood in order to keep the people who bought it from using his old schoolhouse to build a kitchen with the lumber. And he teaches them to hear in the creaking the sound of that distress. In these stories, wood frightens not because it speaks for itself, but because it has been made to communicate Black grief. These stories, you could say, are arts of Black folks distressing the wood, giving it a history so unsettling that it halts the continuance or renovation of the plantation by grounding it in an upsetting history. And I was thinking of another artwork I encountered last year at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum that sought to fix some of those associations. This is Steve McQueen's The Lynching Tree. Captured on a New Orleans plantation, this photo opens out into an oak tree that McQueen photographed while directing 12 Years a Slave. Rather than exhibiting the violence shown in the film, the photo invites viewers to imagine instead that violence it feels bound to appear when a Black gaze falls on a southern tree. As the museum description recounts, such a gaze sees the beautiful landscape as a surface to be seen through. The nudge to make more of this tree prompts me to see more horrors in its form, as the two women behind me try to recall the line from Toni Morrison's Beloved, the one about how the beauty of the landscape contrasts with the violence of lynching, the one about the guilt the formerly enslaved Sethe feels, that the sycamores of her memory were so beautiful that they beat out the bodies hanging from them every time. And rather than confining this way of looking to the south, the exhibit asks us to contemplate the hidden scars revealed in the lynching tree, even as we absorb the natural beauty that surrounds us in northern spaces like Boston, the museum courtyard. And while this is important work, I'm also thinking about what it means to invite Black viewers to slip again from that present peace in the museum courtyard into yet another site of past horror. The push to see through the beauty of the landscape to latent historical traumas, I'm suggesting, is part of that familiar way in which we understand the Black gaze. And so much of my thinking here tonight comes from an encounter I had with one of my students in a former Ghosts of Race course that I taught, where they came to me at the end very distressed and in tears, and they wanted to do, as a Black female student, very brilliant, who wanted to do Black study, but said that felt like the content was so heavy. Was asking, I don't know if I could do this work. I don't even know how you do it. And so a lot of me is thinking again about what it means to sort of tighten some of these connections in the landscape. Where McQueen asks us to see the hideous in a beautiful tree, horror is one of the genres that allows artists to fashion trees that immediately make the horrors of history legible on the landscape. They can change the shape of a tree from beautiful surfaces into unsettling images that reflect our concern for history. Such is the case with the sinister-looking tree from Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow that lies fittingly at the end of the Indian Trail. It's called the Tree of the Dead. So there's this really astonishing moment where the hero peels back the bleeding bark of the tree to reveal a cachet of decapitated heads that opens up into the tree. This tree is a gateway between worlds, he said. And Burton's tree takes new root in the Black American imagination, which it is evoked in P.J. Clarke's 2020 novel Ring Shout in order to develop a critique of racial violence. Drawing upon Burton-like imagery, Clarke fashions a haunted oak tree that is both a trigger for thinking about racial violence and an opportunity to critique our hunger for images of Black distress. The tree that Clarke's protagonist happens upon in a forest, the dead angel oak tree, it's called, is as twisted as the history the narrator is forced to relive in it. Its name in the novel comes from an allegedly haunted tree that sits on the very real Angel Oak Plantation in South Carolina, where lynching stories are today regularly repackaged as ghost stories to lure tourists. Clarke's tree has no leaves, but bones on its branches, and like Burton, when the bark is peeled away, guts ooze out and draw the protagonist inside, where she's forced to relive memories of Klan violence. Venturing into this tree is an opportunity to understand hate, as one of the characters says. But we also understand the horrifying appetite for memories of Black suffering. Within this tree resides the novel's mythic monsters, who once stole and dissected slaves because misery fascinated them. Inside, they make the protagonist relive painful childhood memories of racial violence as she protests having my misery, my pain, served up to these monsters on a plate. Her takeaway from these encounters, they like the places where we hurt, they use it against us, serves as a real-life critique of tourists who seek out the tree on the plantation, looking for ghost stories about Black suffering as entertainment. The image of fascinated onlookers drawn to images of Black distress expresses a powerful concern for the way outsiders gawk at images of suffering that Black subjects are asked to relive. So one example of how Black authors address this concern comes through in the work of the African-American horror author Tananarive Due, who uses fantasy to engage real-life horror. While Due's horror fiction explores historical traumas inherent in the land, her work also has long presented trees in ways that attempt to repair or redress those damaging associations. In her 1997 novel, My Soul to Keep, her immortal antagonist is traumatically unsettled just by observing a simple tree in his yard. Due writes that he could not ruminate long on the tree's beauty, however, because memory interrupted. He was never able to look upon a tree with the same fondness after one had been conscripted as an agent to lynch him and his wife. And the novel immediately goes into this flashback where, because he's an immortal, he dies while being hung on a tree, only to come back again and again and see his wife's body hanging there, in a scene that sort of suspends you in this traumatic loop. While the scene is powerful, Due questioned in an interview with me if seeing the scene through her eyes was necessary for readers. She spoke now of safeguarding audience members. She said, "You know, now I might write that differently, because lynching as horror is absolutely horrific, but it also treads so closely to the intergenerational trauma, the ancestral trauma, that we're all kind of walking around with. Yes, lynching is horrific, but when we look beyond lynching to what lynching represents, to how it feels to have that in your ancestry, what fantasy elements can we use that would replicate that feeling and replicate that horror without literally re-traumatizing our audiences?" And that's a struggle that all Black horror creators properly deal with from time to time. But rather than just using the fantastic to convey social horror, Due also uses fantastic imagery to shift the associations that trees have in the landscape of horror. Trees become guardians. The same tree that is upsetting in My Soul looks to the character's daughter, this is a quote, like the tree in Poltergeist, considered by his wife and daughter to be a home for a friendly ghost they name Nightsong. Now, I don't know if any of y'all have seen that tree from the film, but that was one that definitely was unsettling in the suburb it belonged in. While the tree opens with patriotic music, panning down from tree-dappled hills to the housing community below, we are introduced to this black gnarled tree that one boy fears is watching him from his bedroom. To console him, the father says, "It's been around here a long time. It was here before my company built the neighborhood. It knows everything about us. That's why I built the house next to us, so it could protect us." But if the tree is a guardian, it is for the natives buried below. Its limbs are the first that the indigenous raise up to attack the family, whose housing community is built atop their ancient Indian burial ground, in a very overly familiar trope in horror films. That a black child in Dew's novel can feel good about that tree indexes a strange alliance of black, green, and native solidarity that comes from feeling a sense of camaraderie with a horrifying image. What was made out in white horror to be a threat becomes to the black child a consoling image. Despite these horrors she associates in her writing, Dew draws upon fantastic associations to show how trees can be ghosted by associations with good spirits that soothe these traumatic associations. Storytelling oft functions as a reparative act of placemaking, of healing the hitherto distressed wood, by granting them affirming associations, often with ancestry. It's how her characters also go to pass down good associations, as when the protagonist of her supernatural thriller, The Good House, finds solace beside a tree because she says, "Grandma Marie used to tell me that the spirit of my grandma lived in this tree, and that she herself would come rest there among its branches after she died." So black art becomes a way or an effort to mediate between seeing the beauty in the landscape and the horrifying history that it dissembles. A novel that addresses this concern outright is LaTanya McQueen's 2021 ghost novel, When the Reckoning Comes. Her dedication, For Those Who Have Yet to See, first seems to push us to see through the beauty of the southern landscape to its horrifying history. This is because we are closely aligned with the gaze of the protagonist, which, as McQueen writes, was all she could see, the ways in which they'd been harmed. When she looked at the trees, she saw all the bodies hang from them. But halfway into the novel, the author introduces another way of looking in the form of a black resident who is developing a photography project to excavate the joys overlooked in black history and arguably the novel. His photos of black life, we're told, aim to put all of their happiness on full display, to document people living day to day and show the beauty of their lives. We got poverty, but there's joy too, he says. This new perspective makes me feel that her dedication to those who have yet to see might as much be about reclaiming the beauty that the book has previously only asked us to see through. So on that point of joy, I just came back from New Orleans last month, where I was trying to do some ghost research. And there were plenty of stories about lynching-related ghosts. During that visit, though, I was happy to come across the work of one photographer who is intent on capturing exactly the kind of images of black joy that McQueen refers to. The New Orleans native Brandon Callendar documents black joy centered around trees. His collection, All of Me Remembers, asks, how do you dance when we swing from trees? Whether discussing the portrait of a tree he took on the nearby Whitney slave plantation, or the ancestor tree in the Congo Square, he spoke not of the traumatic weight of history, but of the ancestral lightness he felt while visiting Rames's work. I know my ancestors congregated under this tree, he says. What has it seen? We are more than our pain, and our connection to the land stretches far beyond the trauma that has taken place on it. Holland's photograph reminds us that trees have witnessed more in black life than suffering. I want to pull out one photo I really loved that has a particular image with this resonance with this talk. A small photo appearing within a collage that captures what Holland told me was a tree from a wild forest that grew up in Philadelphia in order to become a space of black gathering. The illustrated eyes make the tree into a witness that beholds something more than black suffering, especially when it's resituated in Holland's collage. It's the photo right there. Its gaze is reshaped so that it's beholding these sort of positive associations in black life. Because Holland shared with me his trees, I shared with him some of the ones that I loved from horror films. Trees that did not stand passively as tools or landmarks to racial terror, but were active and terrifying white settlers, developers, and suburbanites who felt the nation's guilt when looking at the landscape. As just one expression of the forest of shapes we'll be tracking in this series, plant horror has the capacity to uproot the land from these familiar landscapes of racial terror, to make trees not into racial triggers, but into unsettling forces that unmake the nation. Where trees have been used against black people in life, horror films regularly present trees as the most fantastic sites of resistance to the violent creep of civilization. And so in the following image is kind of where I'm thinking of that skillet work where the faces come through. However light their engagement with settler history, mainstream horror often uses trees to reflect anxieties about human supremacy and expansion that may feel cathartic to Black viewers. Using just ordinary trees, not the exotic plants typical to plant horror, the films I preview stage unsettling moments where dominant groups are displaced from the effort of homemaking. For marginalized specters like myself, there is a kind of delicious reversal here. Dominant subjects get a chance to see distressed in their wood what we do in ours, the tragic images of those they have lost, or killed, or repressed. The tree faces I explore feel like a twist on something Dawn Keatley explores in her seminal essay, Six Species on Plant Horror, regarding the medieval figure of the Green Man, whose face, overtaken by flora, conveys the primal dread that civilization feels that it's being overtaken by plants. But rather than sharing in this fear, Black audiences and artists, I'll conclude, find catharsis watching plants life once used against them now turn up against settlements. And so I'm thinking of one writer I really love, Leila Taylor, in her memoir Darkly, talks of what she calls the eco-home invasion, of watching tree vines rise up and crush houses. And she speaks there of what she calls a satisfaction of watching nature's comeuppance, or what excites in her a dark pleasure by offering a glimpse of the end of civilization. The horror reflects an underlying anxiety that the land itself resists the nation's claim to it. Unlike the kindly grandmother Willow of Pocahontas, horror's tormented trees, like the gnarled face on the cover of Blair Witch 2, evoke unsettling anxieties about residing on native land. Take, for instance, the colonial folk horror film Eyes of Fire, where settlers seizing Shawnee land are terrorized by a malevolent forest spirit whose face appears menacingly in tree bark along with other subjects. It's a devil tree, one character says. Some Indians believe that the devil isn't a dark angel who lives someplace else, like down below. Every time innocent blood is spilled, it sinks into the earth and joins in a particular spot with the blood of other victims who died before it. Until finally, the souls of the slaughtered creatures gathered together into a breathing spirit, a devil that captures the living and commands their shadow. That tree says that this valley is where the lost blood gathers. It is the home of the devil, he says. Are these shapes that we encounter in the forest the faces of those we have wronged in the development of this country? Plant horror here provokes a sense of guilt that whatever land acknowledgments we might make, the land in horror never quite acknowledges you. Others relocate this terror from the forest to the bordering suburb, as in The Guardian, where a forest spirit threatens the suburb that wishes to incorporate it as scenery. The film opens with an architect celebrating the glassy modernist architectures that showcase nature, trees, and the home. But soon, even the consoling shadows of branches on the bedroom ceiling grow disturbing as a husband discovers that his nanny, a druid, has been offering her body and their babies to an ancient druidic tree. There should be closure when the patriarch finally cuts down the tree in spurts of gore and assures his wife, "You're safe, honey." But his distrustful gaze on trees flanking their house says otherwise. Such images convey a fear of an old world that pushes back against New World sprawl. As Agent Mulder explains of the glowering tree faces in the X-Files, civilization is pushing very hard into these forests. Maybe something in these woods is finally pushing back. And I'm going to skip this episode. It's from the TV show Beastmaster, but it's a really fascinating episode with Grace Jones that does similar work. In these fantasies, brown beings believed to be non-sentient resources dispute the civilizations we build on their backs. The horror of their unexpected animacy sets up the cruel pun in the indie horror film Deadwood, as the pleading faces of white campers protrude from the bark, sentenced there by a spirit who's the only person of color in the film. When the last survivor threatens to burn down the whole forest, the spirit taunts her by adopting the shifting voices of her slain friends. "We're still here. You can be with us. We're all here." Often, the horror is about overturning nation and detouring its expansion. By resisting our uses, such trees make human subjects to a nature they only believe they have mastered. This irony of plant horror is best exemplified in the short film from the horror anthology Creepshow. When a white man, played by Stephen King, feels horror at the vegetation sprouting from his body as a TV plays a fitting monologue from the movie A Star is Born. Oh, everybody laughed at us, as they all did at the other pioneers. They said this country would never be anything but a wilderness. We didn't believe that. We were going to make a new country. However shallow these engagements with settler history may be, a green mutiny resembles a black and brown one, for in targeting developers, such trees demolish, along with civilization, those hierarchies of being that underwrite their claim to land. Trees once cleared away or used to fashion landscapes of racial terror now rebel against the settlement. This reversal ironizes the colorblind violence of the plants in M. Night Shyamalan's 2008 movie The Happening, in which all the trees and plants instruct humans to all go kill themselves. In this image of mass suicide that results, there's an expression of what it means for white people to have nature's beauty suddenly turn against you. As the white survivors drive to safety, passing several bodies hanging from trees, they seek shelter somewhere. They use to hide people from slave chasers, the character says. The end of the world for them feels like a return to slavery from the wrong end, as they outrun the very trees that they once used to establish their dominion. But what consolation might black spectators find in a world where revenge in the form of ecological catastrophe is more punishing for those on the margins? Ecological punishment is implied to be sweepingly colorblind, as exemplified in the South African fungal horror film, Gaia, where a black man pleads, "Kill me," as his body hideously sprouts the most beautiful blooms. His image spectacularizes what plant scholars would call a disintegration of the human into the face of vegetable indifference that subjects us to the very indifference that we've shown upon nature. And so there's this interesting cultist in the film who is sort of railing against humanity, who's always choosing its own demise by building up this technocratic society. And they say all we could do is wish for a swift end to humanity, and what they call a swift end to the Anthropocene. When no one is spared the vengeance of the vegetable kingdom, who would root for the plant? One suggestion I've made, beginning with The Black Woman and Little Shop of Horrors, is that black life still has motive to root for the nation-ending plant. And it's interesting that in the scene we opened with, that even as they're bidding you not to feed the plant, they're also sort of pointing and commanding and feeling a type of glee in unleashing it on a civilization that has trapped them. So it's fitting in this regard that the film, the 1960 film, is one of the first ones, The Little Shop of Horror, that convenes this tradition of showing faces in plants. Approached from this angle, we can imagine why plant horror has had to grapple with a certain anxiety that black subjects might enjoy watching plants unmake the human world. As black queer author Danny Lore writes in their introduction to the anthology To Root Somewhere Beautiful, we might have reason to celebrate the soil's vengeance of the last remaining seeds germinating and slithering its tendrils into the soil we've destroyed. It's the soil making itself hospitable for things that consume us with root and petal. It's nature fighting back against it all, they write. The relief that black people might feel is exemplified in a short story from the collection, R.J. Joseph's We Were Never Meant to Be Buried, whose protagonist fantasized about new plants growing. And I won't say more about this other than what's interesting is that here the plants that rise up are actually fighting gentrification in Houston, Texas. And so the creation of this thorny spot is actually thwarting that process of encroachment. And here's where I'll end on the work of Hugh Hayden, who, to my eye, works a similar beauty with wood. Hayden's art grants us an opportunity to explore the images we project onto black woodworking. His abstraction invites multiple ways of seeing black life in the wood, and I love how he finds himself in and deliberately chooses woods that speaks to him at a level of race. Chestnut, cedar, or black lotus, black walnut, and Gabon ebony, which he uses to make chairs, desks, and cribs, whose botanical forms left unpruned, allow the trees to outgrow their intended uses in the worlds we are making. He designs spaces that resist being used, like his briar patch, where orderly rows of desks are interrupted by branches wildly extending from the seats. Y'all really do have to see this at the rows. Like the Brer Rabbit folk tale it's named after, the exhibit illustrates how black folks find refuge from captivity in thickets felt to be unnavigable. The meanings Hayden carves out of wood branch out from the hold that lynching has on the arboreal imagination, imagining unruly forms, brown and wild, rising up to reclaim the man-made world. He returns the simple oak, with its straightforward association with lynching, to a complex web of meanings rooted in black life. And for me, this expresses what I love most about plant horror when seen through a black lens. Although his work is widely regarded as addressing the felt uninhabitability of space, we need not imagine this uninhabitability in a negative way. It might also be an active way of rehabilitating meanings made possible within this black eco-Gothic imaginary I've traced, where the arboreal world springs up to resist its intended uses. The Gothic tenor of his homework exhibit comes through in sculptures whose smooth surfaces, be they cabins or skeletons, are interrupted by thorns and branches. And so I'm hoping you can hear the overlap between descriptions of his work in plant horror. Dr. Sarah Montress, who describes Hugh Hayden's work, writes that his work is armored with branches or thorny barbs. These everyday objects become uncannily strange, as if nature herself is lashing out in self-protection. Relatedly, a plant horror scholar, Jill E. Anderson, describes what she calls the overreaching of plant life as being a kind of betrayal of the promise of disciplined abundance, saying the way that these branches become undisciplined, right, sort of challenges the way we go to appropriate them. I've shown why these images might not be so distressing for black subjects who watch unruly plant life branch out and overtake the forms we have prepared. As they lash out, they allow us to envision other grounds of black livability. A thorny nightmare of uninhabitability might be, for the black queer subject, a dream of a more habitable world. This is the point that Stephanie K. Dunning makes when she sides with plants over humans in her reading of the plant horror film, The Girl with All the Gifts, which is a fungal horror film about a fungus that turns people into zombies. She writes, "The end of the state is the beginning of true freedom." And she describes moments where the human literally recedes back into the realm of plants, she writes, as being relieving. And so I'll close here, but I'm so interested in this moment because it comes in a scene where one of the black main characters who represents the threat of the fungus, she's shown right there, is confronting a white man who feels threatened by the world that the plants are creating. And he says the world is ending, and she says it's not ending, it's just not yours anymore. In the horror tradition I have sketched, this joy might be the kind of pleasure cinema offers when trees shake free their status as symbols of racial terror to become unsettling in ways that support black life or simply offer relief and catharsis. What might present as distressingly inhospitable to the proponents of civilization might appear in the black Gansett horror as occasions for dreaming of another way of life. So I'm going to conclude here. We're going to play the short film from Hayden. And in the following 3 films that we watch, I'll talk a little bit more about the way that it connects with his art. Thank y'all.